Your skin becomes cold and clammy like a reptile's. It takes on a strange, bluish-gray, almost lilac hue, as if you had been soaked for several hours in ice-cold water with ink. Your eyes sink into your skull, surrounded by dark, almost black circles, as if drawn with charcoal on parchment. Your cheeks become hollow, your cheekbones sharpen, turning your still living face into a desiccated death mask. Your blood thickens. It becomes like tar, like black viscous resin that barely flows through your veins. The heart desperately tries to push this thick sludge, but weakens with every beat, choking on its own efforts, making muffled, panicked thrusts. Cramps twist your legs into painful stone-like knots, from your calves to your thighs, forcing you to scream silently because there is no strength left to scream. Your hands cramp up so much that your fingers resemble the talons of a bird of prey, and the skin on them wrinkles like a washerwoman's after a full day's work. You are turned inside out, but it is not ordinary vomit. It is a clear, almost odorless stream, resembling rice water. There is no fever, no cough, no sore throat, only a piercing, grave-like cold, an all-consuming weakness, and a deafening silence within. There is only an unstoppable, humiliating stream that expels life itself from you, liter by liter. Every gram of fluid, every grain of salt, all the electrolytes that make your nerves transmit signals are washed out of your body with frightening speed. You are simply wrung out like a wet rag, until nothing is left of you but a dried up, contorted shell weighing 20 kilograms less than just a few hours before. And this nightmare is orchestrated by a single tiny bacterium invisible to the eye. Its name is cholera. It was born in the warm, murky, brackish waters of the Ganges Delta in India. For millennia, it lived there, in its own world, recycling the chitinous shells of microscopic crustaceans. It was merely a janitor of the ocean, a humble cog in the gigantic mechanism of nature. But one day, along with water, it entered a human, by chance, and it discovered that the human intestine is a perfect incubator, warm, moist, full of nutrients, the perfect vehicle for conquering the world. To break out and infect the next victim, the bacterium learned to produce a powerful toxin. It is not a poison in the usual sense. It is a molecular key that perfectly fits the lock on the surface of intestinal cells. It breaks them open and permanently opens the water channels. The floodgates open, and water rushes from your body into the intestine. It was not malicious intent, it was simply evolution in action, merciless, blind survival. And this survival cost humanity millions of lives, turning the history of the 19th century into one continuous obituary. The name cholera was coined by the ancient Greeks. It came from the words chole, bile, and rou, high flow. They believed that 4 fluids, 4 humors flowed within a person: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance of these caused disease. They did not know about bacteria. They could not look inside a cell. They saw only the horrifying result, a body emptying itself, spewing streams of fluid. They were not so far from the truth. Cholera did indeed disrupt the balance, fatally. The first documented pandemic, the first of 7 waves of global terror, begins in 1817. The monsoon season in Bengal was unusually wet and long. The sacred Ganges River overflowed its banks, flooding villages, rice paddies, and cities. The water mixed everything: human waste, animal carcasses, the contents of cesspools, ash from funeral pyres. A perfect warm broth for the cholera vibrio was formed. It It found itself closer to people than ever before, in every cup of water, on every piece of food. The disease erupted with the fury of a forest fire. People collapsed in the streets, in the fields, in their own homes. Their bodies dried out in a matter of hours, turning into ghastly, contorted mummies. The mortality rate reached 75%. 3 out of 4 who fell ill were doomed. In a few months, the infection seized a territory of hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, advancing along trade routes. The locals called it the Blue Death because of the cadaverous cyanotic color of the skin. But the real global terror was yet to come. The British Empire at that time was at the peak of its power. Its ships plied all oceans. Its soldiers marched on all continents. They carried the white man's burden, civilization, and progress. And along with it, its diseases. In the holds, in barrels of fresh water, in the intestines of soldiers and sailors. Cholera boarded British merchant ships and military transports in the port of Calcutta. It hid in barrels of water filled directly from the Ganges. It lurked in the intestines of sailors and soldiers who did not yet feel symptoms. It set off on its first world tour. The ships sailed to the ports of Arabia, Persia, and Africa. In every port they left not only goods but also an invisible killer. Soon all of Asia from China to the Caspian Sea was engulfed in fire. But this was only the beginning. The bacterium was moving west. Its first European victims were the port cities of the Russian Empire, Astrakhan and Tiflis. The disease arrived with Persian merchants. The authorities, frightened by the reports, tried to impose a quarantine, block roads, and halt trade. But the population rebelled. The common people, exhausted by poverty and the arbitrariness of officials, did not believe in an invisible contagion. They believed in a conspiracy. The doctors and the police were deliberately poisoning the people to seize their meager property. That it was the Poles, the eternal enemies, poisoning the wells. The cholera riots began. Mobs armed with clubs and axes smashed hospitals, killed doctors, and burned quarantine posts. They fought against their own salvation in a wild, primal terror. But the bacterium paid no attention to human folly. It simply continued its journey north to the heart of the empire, to Moscow. At first, the rest of Europe and America looked down on this with colonial arrogance. Cholera? That's a disease of dirty, backward Asian peoples. A disease of savages living in poverty and ignorance. The civilized world, with its science, its enlightenment, its clean streets, it was certainly not a threat to them, especially not to Paris, the heart of world culture, the city of light and reason. And indeed, the first wave of the epidemic bypassed France, but not thanks to advanced medicine, but thanks to the strictest border control and total isolation, which almost paralyzed the economy. But this could not last long. Trade demanded open borders. In March 1832, an invisible killer at last broke through the cordons. It arrived with English travelers who had crossed the English Channel. It penetrated Paris, and from there, like a wildfire, it spread throughout all of France and then to London. The nightmare began in the very heart of civilization. No plague was ever so terrible and ruinous. Prince Prospero was happy, dauntless, and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and retired with them to one of his fortified abbeys. They decided to lock themselves away, cutting off all entrances and exits, so that the madness of despair would not penetrate from the outside. They were jesters, improvisatori, dancers, and musicians. There was beauty, there was wine, there was security. And outside reigned the Red Death. Blood was its emblem and its seal, the horrific crimson of blood. A sudden dizziness, an agonizing spasm, then blood began to seep from all the pores, and death came in just half an hour. The scarlet stains on the body, and especially on the face of the victim, were the terrible brand that deprived them of the help and sympathy of those around them. This is an excerpt from the story The Mask of the Red Death by the American writer Edgar Allan Poe. Literary scholars still debate which specific epidemic inspired the writer. Many lean toward tuberculosis, from which his young wife Virginia was dying a painful death. But the symptoms described by Poe, suddenness, swiftness, inevitability, much more reminiscent of cholera. With one important exception. The most disgusting, humiliating manifestation of the disease, an endless stream of dehydrating diarrhea, Poe elegantly replaced with something more noble and dramatic, with blood. In reality, it was all much more prosaic, dirtier, and more terrifying. But Poe's story was not just a morbid fantasy. It was a ghastly, almost documentary reflection of reality. It is known that Parisians in the spring of 1832, trying to maintain their presence of mind in the face of imminent death, threw themselves into unbridled, feverish revelry. They organized balls and masquerades, danced cholera waltzes and quadrilles. Newspapers of the time wrote that the merriment was hysterical, almost demonic. People danced on floors that became slippery from spilled wine, sweat, and, as was whispered, the stomach contents of those who had already fallen victim to the disease right on the dance floor. It was a desperate dance on the edge of the grave. In Poe's story, the gigantic clock of ebony was a symbol of inexorably flowing time, of approaching doom. Every hour it would strike and the music would cease and the dancers would freeze in fear. And the mysterious masked figure, of course, was the personification of the disease itself, which, despite the locked doors and iron bolts, still penetrated the isolated abbey. There was no doubt it was the Red Death. It crept in during the night like a thief. One by one the revelers fell in the blood-splattered halls, and each died in the very posture in which the blow had struck him, and the life of the ebony clock went out with the life of the last of the revelers. And the flames of the braziers expired, and over all, darkness, ruin, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion. And that is exactly how it was. During the Parisian cholera balls, people really did drop dead right in the middle of a dance. A sudden spasm, a short cry, and the body would go limp. But the others, seized by a morbid drunken gaiety, paid it almost no attention. The orchestra did not fall silent. They just kept dancing, stepping over the fall. Special servants on duty at the balls would catch those who fell, often still alive but already in their death throes, and drag them into side rooms so as not to disturb the others. Then the bodies, wrapped in sheets, were loaded onto special carts that continuously circulated through nighttime Paris and were hastily taken away to the cemetery. It was a contagion, after all. They were buried in a hurry, without funeral rites, in enormous mass graves. Often, they were buried alive. This was another special, soul-chilling horror spawned by cholera. The disease could cause a condition known as cholera sicca, or dry cholera, in which there were almost no external symptoms, but the person would fall into a deep collapse, indistinguishable from death. The pulse became so weak that it was impossible to feel it on the wrist or neck. Breathing became barely perceptible, shallow. The body grew cold, the skin took on a deathly pallor. The person appeared dead. There were many such cases in both the first and second pandemics. It is now that doctors have pulse oximeters, cardiac monitors, and ECGs. Back then, they didn't even have a reliable stethoscope to listen for a heartbeat. The diagnosis of death was made by eye, a small mirror to the mouth, a feather to the nostrils. If the mirror didn't fog up and the feather didn't stir, it meant they were dead. To the morgue, to the cemetery. For the rich who were terrified of premature burial, a solution was devised: safety coffins. These were expensive custom-made boxes equipped with a complex system. Inside there was an air tube leading to the surface and a rope connected to a bell above the grave. If you woke up underground in the darkness and silence, you had a chance to ring the bell and call for help. For those who were poor, simpler designs existed. A special device with a cord was placed on the deceased's arm or leg. If the person came to and pulled on it, a signal would also sound above. As soon as the cemetery alarm went off, gravediggers would run with shovels to dig up the resurrected. In 1832 alone, at a single Parisian cemetery, 16 people were saved in this way. How many could not be saved? No one will ever know. In the spring of 1832, the cholera epidemic, having crossed the Atlantic on ships with Irish immigrants, reached the port cities of Canada, and then the United States. And it is important to understand, 19th century America had nothing in common with the modern America of skyscrapers and Hollywood. In those days, people regarded their own excrement completely differently, without squeamishness. They lived side by side with it. In large cities such as New York in the 1830s, there was no centralized water supply or sewage system, and of course no toilets in the houses. People relieved themselves in cesspits in their yards or simply in chamber pots, the contents of which were splashed out directly onto the street or into a gutter in the morning. At first, this human waste, which was called night soil, was collected by special services and used as fertilizer on farms in neighboring Queens and Brooklyn. But when the amount of fertilizer exceeded agricultural needs, the surplus began to be simply dumped in piles right within the city limits, covered with a thin layer of earth. In the end, such dumps occupied 1/10 of the entire area of Manhattan. The city was literally built on a foundation of its own excrement. Drinking water was also a problem in Manhattan. Its only source was the glacial Collect Pond. Once crystal clear, by the beginning of the 19th century it had turned into a foul, bubbling swamp. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, breweries, soap factories, all dumped their industrial and organic waste directly into it. The water was filled with cow remains, entrails, and blood mixed with arsenic, mercury, and tannic acids. Of course, New York had wells too, but due to Manhattan's rocky soil, their depth did not exceed 9 meters, and the standard was 15. So everything that, as you'll recall, occupied 1/10 of the city, conveniently seeped through the ground and ended up directly in these shallow wells. The water tasted disgusting, brackish, and reeked of rot. But there was no choice. They had to drink it. The city urgently needed a proper water supply system. Just such a system was proposed in 1797 by the physician Joseph Brown and the talented engineer William Weston. They wanted to draw clean water from the Bronx River, 40 kilometers from New York, and filter it through a system of sand and gravel filters, a method that, by the way, is still used today and can remove up to 99% of bacteria. They proposed using powerful steam engines to pump the water through durable cast iron pipes to public hydrants. The entire project required about $200,000, a huge sum of money for that time. But then a politician got involved. His name was Aaron Burr. At that time, he was a New York State senator, an ambitious and unscrupulous man who would later go down in history as the killer of one of the founding fathers of the USA, Alexander Hamilton. Burr was pursuing his own selfish interests. He wanted to open a bank in the city affiliated with his political party. To get a charter from the state, it was necessary to prove that the bank was being opened by respectable people doing something useful for society, something like building a water supply system. Burr created his own cheaper project, At a meeting with city officials, he gave a fiery speech about the grasping swindlers, Brown and Weston. He claimed that their engineering marvel would ultimately cost not $200,000, but $1 million, almost as much as the country allocated for its entire navy. Unprecedented squandering. We gentlemen, he argued, must know how to invest our money wisely. The official's decision was obvious. New York signed a contract with Burr's company, called the Manhattan Company. When Brown and Weston saw their competitor's project, it all became clear to them. It was pure hack work, a scam. New York would never see clean water. The water system was built without any fancy steam engines, using ordinary horsepower. Horses walked in a circle, driving the pumps, and in the process defecated directly onto the wooden pipes that were laid instead of cast iron ones because they were cheaper. There were only a few water hydrants, and all of them were in wealthy neighborhoods. And as a water source, they decided to use that same filth-filled, infamous collect pond. In the end, Aaron Burr's Manhattan Company spent about $172,000 on New York's water supply. But Burr got what he wanted. The company's charter contained a cunning clause that allowed it to use surplus capital for any financial operations. After the construction was completed, he opened his own bank. And not just anywhere, but on Wall Street. This bank still exists today. Today it is known as J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, one of the world's largest financial conglomerates, born from dirty water and political corruption. And of course, when cholera came to the city in 1832, along with a debilitating drought, it very quickly found its way into the rotten wooden pipes of the New York water system. In the heat, people drank liters of raw water, each gulp containing hundreds of millions of invisible cholera vibrios. Yes, they died in boiling water, but Americans preferred to drink tea with milk, which market vendors would shamelessly dilute with the very same raw tap. The vibrios also died in strong spirits, so those who preferred whiskey or bourbon to beer fell ill less often. But wealthy Americans drank light cocktails with ice made from the same contaminated water. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Officially, the city's health department announced 3,500 deaths. Unofficial data suggest 9,000. But most likely, the real number was even higher. The collect pond was eventually just filled in by the community. Later, New York's most infamous slum, 5 Points, arose on this site, where unsanitary conditions prevailed for a long time. The next cholera outbreak in New York began right there. In order not to sow unnecessary panic and harm business, the mayor of New York and the city's health department chose not to inform the population about the contagion running rampant in the city. The logic was deadly. Why fight cholera? So what if a few thousand people die? We have tens of thousands of immigrants arriving from Europe. We're still coming out ahead. Besides, a quarantine would hurt trade. It's foolish to restrict commercial activity. And anyway, who said cholera is transmitted from person to person? It's an atmospheric disease. It's carried on the wings of the wind. And in these words, strangely enough, there was a grain of truth. Epidemics did indeed break out suddenly, in entire districts at once, as if everyone were simultaneously enveloped in a cloud of some poisonous gas. This led us to an ancient medical theory that had held sway over the minds of doctors for thousands of years, the theory of miasmas. According to this idea, all diseases were caused by so-called miasmas, bad air, foul vapors that rose from decaying organic matter, swamps, garbage heaps, and the bodies of the sick. The smell was the disease. To get rid of miasmas, doctors in the cholera barracks would constantly move patients from place to place, air out the rooms, and burn incense and gunpowder. But no one thought to wash their soiled linen, soaked with excrement. As soon as the traces of diarrhea dried, they turned into dust. This dust, full of vibrios, rose into the air, was inhaled and settled on food and water. There was logic in the miasma theory, but doctors were paying attention to the wrong thing. They fought the smell, not its source, the filth. Patients, meanwhile, were treated according to the same ancient principles. The excess bad fluid had to be removed. And if it was already pouring from every orifice, why interfere? The more fluid that came out of a person, the healthier they would be, unless of course they died of dehydration first. Cholera patients were forbidden to drink. They were kept in hot, stuffy rooms so that the bad bile would exit with their sweat. They were given powerful emetics such as antimony and laxatives like castor oil to speed up the purification process. They were subjected to bloodletting, further dehydrating and weakening an already exhausted body. This was not treatment. This was methodical torture. The lucky ones were those who fell into the hands of alternative medicine doctors, the so-called hydropaths. These doctors believed that the body, on the contrary, needed to be saturated with water. They gave patients cold water to drink and wrapped them in wet, cold sheets. Incredibly, this method worked. People survived, but official medicine considered hydropaths to be charlatans and continued to stubbornly cling to the archaic theory of miasmas. For one London anesthesiologist, John Snow, who in the line of duty worked extensively with smells and gases, all this talk of miasmas seemed strange, to say the least. For years he had experimented on himself with chloroform, ether, and benzene, inhaling their vapors. He knew for certain, if cholera were contracted from miasmas by inhaling them, the disease would primarily affect the respiratory system, the lungs. But this was not happening. Cholera struck a different system, the digestive one. Therefore, Snow reasoned, the bacillus enters the body with something we swallow, with food or, more likely, with water. It was simple, elegant, and logical. During another terrible cholera outbreak in London in 1854, Snow began his own investigation. He was like a detective from the novels of Conan Doyle, who would only appear decades later. He walked the dirty, rubbish-strewn streets of London's Soho district, where the disease was rampant, and methodically marked on a map every house where there was a sick or deceased person. He questioned people, trying to find a common link, and he found it. Almost all the victims lived nearby and drew water from the very same public pump on Broad Street. When Snow obtained permission to dismantle the pump, he discovered what he had expected. Its brickwork was damaged, and sewage was seeping into it from a nearby cesspool, into which waste had been dumped from the house where the first person in the area to fall ill, a small child, had died. The water that hundreds of people drank was contaminated with feces. Two facts served as key evidence. The workers at the local brewery did not get sick. They were given free beer and did not drink the water. And an elderly woman who lived on the other side of London died of cholera. It turned out she loved the taste of the water from Broad Street so much that she sent her servant for it every day. It seemed this was it, irrefutable proof. Cholera is caused not by some mythical bad air, but by contaminated water. And this was not being said by some random person, but by John Snow, a respected member of London's medical elite, a man close to Queen Victoria herself. He had personally administered chloroform to her during the births of her 8th and 9th children. But between John Snow and the rest of the medical community, an insurmountable wall of misunderstanding had risen. Those on the other side of the wall repeated one after another like a mantra. This strange newfangled theory contradicts the time-tested principles of Hippocrates. Water? It cannot be. Snow presented his findings to the authorities and demanded that the handle be removed from the pump on Broad Street. He was not believed, but just in case, to calm the panicking population, the handle was removed anyway. And the outbreak of the disease in that area sharply declined. But this convinced no one. He was called a traitor to the interests of public health, an upstart trying to undermine the authority of gray-haired professors. Exhausted by the struggle, Snow abandoned his cholera research and dedicated himself to a fundamental work on anesthesia. Having barely finished it, he died of a stroke at the age of 45. He never saw his triumph. John Snow's correctness was recognized only decades after his death. Ironically, while John Snow was building his epidemiological theory in London, another scientist in Italy was already looking at the causative agent of the disease itself through a microscope. His name was Filippo Pacini. In that same year, 1854, while examining the intestinal tissues of those who had died from cholera, he discovered and drew tiny curved rods, which he named vibrios. He published his work, but the medical community, completely absorbed in the miasma debates, simply ignored his discovery. Pacini died in obscurity, and his contribution was only recognized many years later, when the world was already celebrating another man. Only at the end of the 19th century, with the development of microscopy, did a new, scientifically based germ theory of disease emerge, associated with the names of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. And in 1884, the German microbiologist Robert Koch, during an expedition to India, the very epicenter of the contagion in Calcutta, managed to isolate and examine the causative agent under a microscope, a curved rod resembling a comma, the cholera vibrio. Koch also made a key observation. The disease was rampant where people drank water from ponds and canals, whose banks latrines were often blockaded. The conclusion was unequivocal. The cholera pathogen is transmitted through water. It would seem that was it. The debate was over. Koch was right, the miasma theory was dead. But traditional medicine continued to persist. Another prominent German specialist, Max von Pettenkofer, director of the Institute of Hygiene in Munich, devised his own complex theory, according to which not only the vibrio was needed for cholera to arise, but also special groundwater and geological conditions. He was so confident in his correctness and so wanted to publicly humiliate Koch that he took an insane, desperate step. He ordered from Koch a fresh culture of cholera vibrios, isolated from the stool of a recently deceased patient. On October 7, 1892, in front of witnesses, the 73-year-old professor drank a whole glass of water to which he had added this culture, containing about 1 billion bacteria. 27 of his colleagues and students did the same. The most interesting part? None of them died. They all got off with mild diarrhea. It was a powerful blow to Koch's theory, and, it seemed, a triumph for Pettenkofer. It is unknown how much longer this battle of wits might have lasted, had chance not put an end to the story. A tragic and convincing one. The German city of Hamburg and its suburb Altona. Both stood on the same river, the Elbe, breathed the same air. The soil and geology were identical. But in 1892, Hamburg fell victim to a terrible cholera epidemic that claimed 10,000 lives in 6 weeks, while Altona was untouched. The question was, why? The answer turned out to be ridiculously simple. Altona, which belonged to Prussia, was required by law to filter its drinking water through sand filters. The wealthy and independent Hamburg considered this an unnecessary expense and drank water straight from the river. Moreover, not a single one of the 345 residents of an apartment building called Hamburger Hof, which was officially part of Hamburg but by chance received its water from Altona's water supply, fell ill. This was the decisive proof. It was the end of the miasma theory. A few years later, Robert Koch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his investigations and discoveries in relation to tuberculosis, but his contribution to the fight against cholera was no less important, and Max von Pettenkofer, whose theory was shattered and whose reputation was destroyed by the Hamburg tragedy, fell into a deep depression and shot himself in 1901. Many scientists participated in the fight against cholera, including Russian ones. Ilya Mechnikov, who discovered phagocytosis, and Nikolai Gamaleya. It was Gamaleya who, as early as 1888, proposed using cholera vibrios weakened by heat to protect against the epidemic. In essence, the world's first killer vaccine. But the bacteriologist Waldemar Hafkin put a final end to this matter. He was Russian, a graduate of Odessa University and a favorite student of Mechnikov. But in his homeland, because of his political views in his youth and his Jewish origin, he was not allowed to work. Hafkin emigrated to France, where at the Pasteur Institute he created the first truly safe and effective cholera vaccine. He could have become rich and famous in Europe, but instead he went to the epicenter of the disease, to India, to test his invention where it was needed most. He wrote in his diary, "The locals nearly stoned me to death. They did not believe me, considering me an agent of the British government who wanted to poison them. Then I first injected myself. Then, to prove its complete safety, I drank the preparation mixed with cholera excrement. Gradually, seeing his selflessness and fearlessness, the people in India came to believe him. Mass vaccination began. Hafkin was called the Great White Healer and the savior of humanity. To defeat cholera, the world's major cities had to completely rebuild themselves. They had to acquire proper water supply and sewage systems. The attitude toward hygiene, human health, and all of medicine as a whole was completely reconsidered. Cholera, that invisible monster from dirty water, taught humanity a cruel, bloody, but incredibly important lesson. You cannot live in filth and hope to remain healthy. So, as strange and cynical as it may sound, great epidemics, though they bring death and suffering, ultimately make life better for the survivors. They mercilessly expose all the sores of society, corruption, ignorance, inequality, and force us to change, to become cleaner, smarter, and more humane. The only question is at what cost? Millions of lives for the right to drink clean water. That was the deal. And although we won that war, the enemy did not disappear. He lay in wait. He is biding his time in warm waters, in disaster zones, in refugee camps. He is waiting for us to forget the lesson again, paid for at such a terrible price.